Casual here. If you are thinking of buying Empire of Sin, are a fan of strategy games, or love the idea of taking on Al Capone in 1920 Chicago, then you've come to the right place. In this video I'll be covering the game's key features, mechanics, structure and gameplay, and of course whether this game is worth playing or not. Before I do, please make sure to subscribe to my channel. It is a big help to me if you do, and let me continue to make more content like this. Empire of Sin is a strategy game based in 1920 Chicago, which came out on the Xbox One in December 2020. This is a game that I was really looking forward to playing, given the mix of strategy, trading and turn-based combat, all set within an era that provides a wealth of atmosphere and storytelling potential. The opening of the game does nothing to dispel this, with a title screen that shows a detailed 1920 Chicago street scene, along with a musical score that is right out of the Roaring Twenties.
You can get much further with a kind word and a gun than you can with a kind word alone.
You take on the role of a mob boss, picking from a cast of interesting characters with unique bonuses, a special combat move and storyline. This storyline plays out through a series of quests which you can complete, or if you prefer, just ignore. In my playthrough, the storyline was bugged and I could not progress it beyond a certain point. This didn't stop me finishing the game though. Your storyline is introduced through a nicely done face-to-face sit-down meeting rather than through a traditional cutscene.
How can you be so cold, Antonio? He's our brother. If we don't do something, they'll lock him up forever, or worse.
It ain't like he did himself any favors, and it ain't like he was framed for a martyr. He did the martyr.
The dialogue options you are given don't seem to have much of an impact on the outcome of the conversation though, which was a little disappointing. Sit-down meetings with mob bosses are used extensively throughout the game. After the first couple though, they become a little tedious and just slow the pace of the game down. When they arise, you have to trek halfway across the city, all of which takes time, when launching straight into them when they occur would have worked just as well. I think it's great that the developers tried something different, but I just don't think that it works. In order to build your empire, you need to acquire rackets. There are various ways to do so, but taking over an existing mob-controlled racket is the only way that costs no money, if you keep the racket the same that is, so it becomes the default option. There are 6 types of racket in the game: speakeasies, casinos, brothels, breweries, hotels and casinos, all of which are pretty self-explanatory. You can invest in each of the rackets to improve them, essentially increasing the number of guards, the quality and popularity, or reducing the chance that you'll be raided. With speakeasies and breweries, you also have the added dimension of alcohol production and consumption to balance. On the face of it, this all sounds pretty good, but in practice it's just too shallow, and more importantly, the margins are razor thin. Most rackets only make a few $100s in each time period in the game. Building an army of gangsters to take over rackets is a much quicker way to build your empire than actually investing in them. Saying that, additional guards are useful for the inevitable retaliation from your rivals, but the rest of the options don't make any meaningful difference to how the game plays. This part of the game also never develops beyond the base model, and so very soon it becomes a grind. Compare this to the classic game Civilization, with its research which allowed you to upgrade units, to develop new buildings, to add the great minds of the world to your empire, and to ultimately discover wonders of the world. To enjoy anything, you need to be able to see how it is adding value, and I just didn't get that from building my mob empire. Empire Sin also includes diplomacy options, allowing you to strike deals with other mob bosses, trade with them, agree to provide protection for them, or even to go to war with them. There are a number of issues with this though. Quite often the deals you offer bear no relationship to the rackets you actually have. Fine when you have the full complement, but of little use at the start of the game. Changes in your relationship with other mobs also don't match up to the actions you take. But probably the biggest issue is that diplomacy is irrelevant. I ignored the police, who are a separate faction. They never once raided my rackets. With 6 or 7 gangsters in your crew, you can take down your rival mob bosses, so why bother negotiating with them? When you take down a rival, you instantly take over all of their empire. providing you with a boost of income to get more gangsters, and so on. Well, this leads us nicely to the combat sections. As soon as you jump into the combat, you start to see some of the big issues with it. The combat lacks pretty much everything you would expect from a turn-based shooter. The maps are poorly designed with inadequate or poorly placed cover. The game starts you in combat with your players often on top of the enemies, leaving one side or the other completely exposed depending on the turn order. The AI is bizarre, with enemies running into exposed positions, or not attacking your team when clearly they should. Flanking becomes pointless even if there was any suitable cover, because you know the enemy is going to charge into open space any second in order to get into range. In one battle I took on 10 enemies with a 3-man team, and I won. The AI is that bad. To top it all off, the graphics are so janky with missed and delayed animations, dead characters standing up at random, or even the hilarious instance when one of my gangsters laid on the floor for a period while still performing actions. I could go on and on. Speaking of my gangsters, in my first impressions video for Empire Sin, I flagged the cast of characters as being a potential highlight of the game with the relationships they build up. However, having played through an entire campaign, I came to realise that, like the rest of this game, the initial promise is not delivered on, and it ends up being just a shallow experience. The relationships don't seem to really affect anything. Whether my gangsters were in love or were rivals, they still performed exactly the same, so in the end I just ignored it. While the musical score is excellent and transports you to Chicago in the 1920s, the feeling is very quickly dispelled by the sterile view of the city itself. This never felt like a living or breathing city, lacking the bustle and grime a big city would have. It felt more like a board game version of the city or a Lego model. The use of the same character models for so many of the inhabitants and furniture in the boss sit-down meetings further helped to dispel the atmosphere and any sense of really being there. The insides of the rackets do look good, with a distinct feel to each of them, but they are identical with every speakeasy looking the same as the next. It is not that the graphics are awful, they are just very uninspiring. The number of graphical glitches does make me think that no one had actually tested the game before launching, reinforcing my view that this is an unfinished game that could have done with more development in a lot of areas. All of my reviews focus on 5 criteria that are important for the casual player. Games like this are as long or as short as you would like them to be. You could put all your money into your gangsters and take out the rival bosses pretty quickly if you would like. Or you can play around building an empire, investing in the rackets, and recruiting an army of gangsters. Sadly though, there was no reference to the empire you built in the closing credits, or a table showing you your best empire so you can compete against yourself. And it doesn't appear that you can win the game just by building an empire. You have to take out your rivals to finish the game. These are all things that you would have expected to be in the game really, to add variety and longevity to it. On the face of it, Empire Sin seems to have a lot of complexity, with page after page of data and metrics to look through. In reality though, the game is very shallow and you can master it very quickly. Too quickly, I would say. The game becomes very repetitive very quickly, and ultimately the poor combat becomes a tedious grind. This is particularly so when a war is declared on you and combat occurs again and again without the slightest pause as your rackets are attacked. If you want to win, or even just to play the game, you have no choice but to grind through this. On the default setting, the game was far too easy, due mainly to the poor AI in the combat sections. I've not played the game on tougher difficulty selections to see if the combat is balanced better at those levels, or factions like the police are at all relevant. I just can't face it right now. But this lack of difficulty certainly adds to the mindless grind that combat soon becomes. There is no multiplayer option with Empire Sin. Having rivals who actually showed some intelligence would certainly improve the game. Sadly, Empire of Sin is not a game I can recommend that you pick up. It's not that it's a really bad game, it's just too shallow, too repetitive, too average in all aspects, and ultimately feels unfinished as a game. If I were to be cynical, I'd say that the development of this game was cut short in order to cash in on the release of Mafia recently, which is a shame given that there is potential here that's just not been developed properly. Even the closing cutscene felt like it was thrown in there at the last moment, and leaves you wondering why you persevered to get to it. Well, I hope that you don't think the same about this video, and thank you very much for watching it. If you like this content, then please do check out my game reviews playlist for more videos just like this one. Content on my channel focuses on first impressions, game reviews, retro replays and game guides, tips and tricks. So do just subscribe to be notified about more content that I release on a regular basis. Until next time, casual out.